The space station orbited a small moon in the Alpha Centauri system, its metal walls humming with the energy of 1,000 different alien technologies. Inside the main hall, beings from across the galaxy gathered around floating screens that showed mathematical equations and scientific formulas that would make Earth's greatest minds weep with confusion. This was the Galactic Academic Exchange, the most important center of learning in known space. Jake Morrison floated near one of the large windows, watching the stars spin slowly past as the station rotated. He was 32 years old, with short, brown hair and the kind of hands that showed he had spent years working with tools and machines. Back on Earth, he had been a NASA engineer, the kind of person who could fix a broken spacecraft with nothing but spare parts and determination. Now he was here, 3 years into humanity's first real attempt to prove they belonged among the stars. It had not been going well. The humans at the exchange were smart by Earth standards, but here they felt like children trying to keep up with university professors. The Xanthari could think in 17 dimensions at once. The Vilkung solved mathematical problems that human computers couldn't even understand. The Rillen processed quantum mechanics the way humans read street signs. Every day brought new reminders that humanity was the youngest and least advanced species in the galactic community. Jake watched as a group of Xanthari students floated past, their crystalline bodies catching the light from the artificial suns that lit the station. They were discussing something about temporal mechanics in their musical language, and even with the universal translator, Jake could barely follow their conversation. One of them looked at him with what might have been pity before turning back to its companions. Professor Zeth was the worst of them all. The Xanthari stood nearly 8 feet tall, with 6 arms that moved like liquid crystal and a face that seemed to be carved from living diamond. He had been teaching at the exchange for 3 centuries and had never met a problem he couldn't solve with pure logic and mathematical precision. He also seemed to take personal pleasure in pointing out human limitations. Jake had been in the professor's advanced physics class for 6 months now, and every day brought new humiliations. Yesterday, Zeth had asked the class to solve a problem about gravitational wave interference. The Xanthari students had their answers in minutes. The Vakan student had found 3 different solutions. Jake had spent 2 hours on it and still couldn't figure out where to start. The human approach to problem solving is fundamentally flawed. The professor had said, his voice carrying the musical tones that made Xanthari speech sound like crystal wind chimes. You rely too heavily on intuition and emotion. Science requires logic, calculation, and systematic thinking. These are qualities your species has not yet developed. The other students had made sounds that the translator couldn't interpret, but Jake was pretty sure they were laughing. He had wanted to argue, to point out that humans had built spacecraft and split atoms and mapped their own DNA. But here, surrounded by beings who could manipulate matter at the quantum level and think in mathematical concepts that didn't even have names in human languages, those achievements felt small and primitive. Today was different, though. Today, Professor Zeth had announced something special. He had spent the last 3 months designing what he called the ultimate test of intelligence, a puzzle so complex that even the Xanthari had trouble with it. It was meant to demonstrate the superiority of pure logical thinking over what he called primitive intuitive responses. The puzzle was a zero-gravity chamber filled with geometric shapes that needed to be assembled into a specific configuration. The catch was that every movement would create equal and opposite reactions, making traditional puzzle-solving approaches impossible. The shapes existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and touching more than one at a time would reset the entire system. I have calculated 1,247 different variables that must be considered before making the first move. The professor had explained to the gathered students. The solution requires understanding of 17 different physical principles and the ability to process quantum mechanical interactions in real time. It is, quite simply, impossible to solve through guesswork or luck. Several alien students had already attempted the puzzle, A Vacan mathematician had gotten halfway through before making a calculation error that sent him spinning helplessly through the chamber. A Rillan quantum specialist had managed to connect 3 of the 7 pieces before the system reset itself. Even a Xanthari student had failed, though she had come closer than anyone else. Jake stood in the observation area, watching the holographic displays that showed the puzzle chamber. The geometric shapes floated in perfect stillness, waiting for the next challenger. They were beautiful in their own way, like abstract art made of mathematics and physics. But they were also terrifying because they represented everything that humans couldn't do, everything that made them feel like children in a universe of adults. Dr. Amy Walsh, Jake's former colleague from NASA, put her hand on his shoulder. She was one of the few other humans at the exchange, a physicist who specialized in spacecraft propulsion systems. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "Nobody expects you to solve something that stumped a Xanthari." Jake looked at the puzzle chamber again. The professor was preparing for another demonstration, his 6 arms moving in complex patterns as he adjusted the holographic controls. Around them, alien students whispered in their various languages, and Jake could feel their expectations. They were waiting for another human failure, another proof that Earth's children didn't belong among the stars. "Maybe that's exactly why I have to try," Jake said. He had spent 3 years watching humans struggle to keep up with alien thinking. 3 years feeling like a primitive savage trying to understand advanced technology. But maybe the problem wasn't that humans were too stupid. Maybe the problem was that they were trying to be something they weren't. Professor Zethka Moore's crystalline face turned toward Jake as he stepped forward. The human volunteer," the professor said, his voice carrying what might have been amusement. "I must warn you, this puzzle has defeated every species that has attempted it. The mathematical complexity alone requires processing power that your neural architecture simply cannot provide." Jake nodded, trying to ignore the way his heart was beating faster. "I understand, Professor, but I'd like to try anyway." The alien students gathered around the observation area, their various forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes. Jake could feel their curiosity, their skepticism, their certainty that he would fail just like all the others. He was about to become another example of human limitations, another proof that Earth's children weren't ready for the galactic community. But as he looked at the puzzle chamber, something stirred in his mind. A memory from childhood, spinning on playground equipment until the world blurred around him. The feeling of motion and balance, of working with physics instead of against it. Maybe the solution wasn't about fighting the puzzle's rules. Maybe it was about dancing with them. The puzzle chamber formed around Jake like a soap bubble made of pure energy, its walls shimmering with colors that had no names in any human language. The transition from the observation deck to the interior was seamless, as if reality itself had simply rearranged itself to accommodate him. One moment he was standing on solid metal flooring, and the next he was floating in perfect weightlessness, surrounded by an endless void that seemed to stretch into infinity. Jake's first instinct was to reach for something solid, anything that would give him a reference point in the disorienting emptiness. But there was nothing except the 7 geometric shapes that floated around him in perfect stillness, each one positioned at exact distances that Professor Zethka Moore had calculated with mathematical precision. The shapes seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once, their surfaces shifting and changing depending on how Jake looked at them. The largest object was a dodecahedron with 12 pentagonal faces, each one covered in symbols that pulsed with soft blue light. As Jake watched, the symbols changed and rearranged themselves, forming patterns that looked almost like writing but in no language he had ever seen. The shape rotated slowly, revealing new surfaces that seemed to exist in spaces that shouldn't have been possible. Near the dodecahedron floated a spiral structure that looked like it had been carved from frozen lightning. It twisted and curved through space in ways that made Jake's eyes water when he tried to follow its path. The spiral seemed to be moving and still at the same time, creating an optical illusion that made his brain hurt. Every time he thought he understood its shape, it would reveal new curves and angles that hadn't been there before. 3 interlocking rings hung suspended in the center of the chamber, each one made of what looked like crystallized starlight. They were perfectly smooth and seemed to generate their own gravity, pulling at each other in complex patterns that created ripples in the space around them. Jake could feel the rings calling to each other, their magnetic fields creating harmonics that resonated in his bones. A pyramid with shifting surfaces floated nearby, its faces constantly changing color and texture. Sometimes it looked like polished metal, sometimes like living wood, sometimes like flowing water frozen in time. The pyramid's edges seemed sharp enough to cut reality itself, and Jake instinctively knew that touching the wrong surface at the wrong time would be dangerous. The sphere with movable segments was perhaps the most complex of all the objects. Its surface was divided into hundreds of triangular pieces that could slide and rotate independently, creating patterns that shifted like a three-dimensional kaleidoscope. The segments moved in response to some internal logic that Jake couldn't understand, clicking and whirring as they rearranged themselves into new configurations. The final 2 objects were rod-like structures that seemed to bend space-time around them. They were identical in size and shape, but one was made of matter so dense that it seemed to pull light into itself, while the other was made of something that repelled photons, creating a dark outline against the void. The space around the rods rippled and distorted, making them difficult to look at directly. Professor Zethkamor's voice echoed through the chamber's communication system, his words translated into English by the universal interpreter. The professor's tone was formal and precise, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. The objective is elegantly simple, human. These 7 objects must form the eternal knot of Velshan, a configuration that represents the mathematical harmony of the universe. Jake tried to imagine what the final configuration might look like, but his mind couldn't process the complexity. The eternal knot was a legendary mathematical concept, something that the Xanthari had been studying for millennia. It was said to represent the perfect balance between order and chaos, the point where all physical laws converged into a single unified truth. You have 1 standard galactic hour to complete the puzzle, the professor continued. The rules are absolute and cannot be bent or broken. Any movement you make will propel you in the opposite direction according to Newton's 3rd law. Any force you apply to an object will affect your own position in equal measure. Touch more than 1 object simultaneously and the puzzle will reset itself to the beginning configuration. The chamber's walls displayed no reference points, no up or down, no north or south. Jake floated in the center of the void, completely cut off from the normal sensory cues that humans use to navigate through space. The only constant was the gentle hum of the energy field that contained him, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Xanthari approach requires calculating 1,247 different variables before making the first move. Professor Zethkamor explained, his crystalline voice carrying notes of superiority. Each object has 17 different interaction modes, and the quantum mechanical effects of their combined presence create exponential complexity. The mathematics alone would challenge your most advanced computers. Jake studied the floating objects, trying to understand their relationships to each other. The dodecahedron symbols seemed to respond to the spiral structure's movements. The 3 rings created harmonic resonances that affected the pyramid's surface changes. The sphere's segments moved in patterns that mirrored the distortions around. The 2 rods. Everything was connected, but the connections were so complex that Jake's human brain couldn't process them all at once. The alien spectators watched through the chamber's transparent walls, their various forms creating a rainbow of colors and shapes around the observation deck. Jake could feel their expectations like a physical weight, their certainty that he would fail just like all the others who had attempted the puzzle. In 3 years of human presence at the Galactic Academic Exchange, no one from Earth had ever solved a challenge of this complexity. Traditional human problem-solving relies on trial and error, the professor continued, his tone becoming more condescending. You attempt solutions randomly, hoping that luck will compensate for lack of understanding. This approach cannot work here. The puzzle requires perfect precision and complete knowledge of the underlying principles. Jake felt a familiar frustration rising in his chest. The professor was right about human limitations, but there was something dismissive in his tone that made Jake want to prove him wrong. Humans had always been told they couldn't do things, that they weren't smart enough or strong enough or fast enough. But somehow they had always found a way. The memory of spinning on playground equipment came back to him, stronger now. The feeling of motion and balance, of working with physics instead of against it. Maybe the solution wasn't about calculating all the variables. Maybe it was about something else entirely, something that couldn't be reduced to numbers and equations. Jake positioned himself in the center of the chamber, studying the floating objects with new eyes. The math was indeed staggering, but math wasn't everything. The universe was mathematical, but it was also musical, rhythmic, alive. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem wasn't to think harder, but to feel deeper, to trust in instincts that had been refined over millions of years of evolution. The chamber fell silent except for the gentle hum of the energy field. Professor Zeth waited for Jake to make his first move, confident that the human would fail within minutes. The alien spectators watched with mixture of curiosity and pity, already preparing to witness another demonstration of human inadequacy. But Jake wasn't thinking about failure. He was thinking about dancing. Instead of reaching for the nearest object like every other challenger had done, Jake did something that made the alien observers gasp in their respective languages. He began to spin. Not wildly or frantically, but with slow, deliberate rotation. That started in his core and spread outward to his arms and legs. He used tiny movements of his limbs to build angular momentum, the same way a figure skater pulls in their arms to spin faster. The watching aliens fell silent, their various forms pressing closer to the observation windows. Professor Zeth crystalline features shifted into what might have been confusion, his 6 arms gesturing in rapid patterns that indicated deep thought. Fascinating, he observed, his voice carrying musical tones of bewilderment. The human appears to be engaging in some form of ritualistic movement. Perhaps a prayer to primitive Earth deities? Jake wasn't praying, he was remembering. As a child, he had spent countless hours on playground equipment, spinning until the world became a blur of colors and sensations. He had learned to navigate by feel rather than sight, to use his body's natural gyroscopic systems to maintain balance and orientation. The sensation of rotation was as familiar to him as walking or breathing. As Jake spun, the chamber around him began to make sense in ways that pure mathematics never could. The 7 objects weren't static puzzles to be solved through calculation. They were part of a dynamic system that responded to motion, rhythm, and timing. The dodecahedron symbols pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The spiral structure seemed to dance in harmony with his rotation. The 3 interlocking rings created musical tones that matched the frequency of his movements. Dr. Amy Walsh, watching from the observation deck, found herself holding her breath. She recognized what Jake was doing because she had seen him work this way before, back at NASA when they were developing new spacecraft attitude control systems. Jake had always been the engineer who could feel what the computers calculated, who could sense the subtle rhythms and harmonics that others missed. He's not fighting the physics, she whispered to herself. He's becoming part of them. The first object Jake approached was the spiral structure, not because logic dictated it should be first, but because its rotation matched his own. As he spun toward it, Jake timed his approach perfectly, using his own angular momentum to create a gentle collision rather than a grab. The object responded to his touch like a dance partner, attaching to his hand with a soft magnetic click that sent vibrations through his entire body. The moment Jake touched the spiral, he could feel its internal geometry through his fingertips. The structure wasn't just a puzzle piece. It was a tool for understanding the relationships between the other objects. As he held it, the spiral began to resonate with the energy fields of the remaining 6 pieces, creating a 3-dimensional map that Jake could sense rather than see. The Alien spectators watched in stunned silence as Jake continued his controlled rotation, now carrying the spiral structure with him. The Xanthari students who had attempted the puzzle before had approached each object with careful calculation, measuring distances and angles with mathematical precision. Jake was doing something entirely different. He was dancing with the puzzle, using his body as both sensor and solution. The dodecahedron came next, its 12 faces spinning in complex patterns that would have confused any computer. But Jake didn't try to understand the patterns intellectually. Instead, he let his rotation sync with the object's movement, feeling for the moment when their rhythms would align. When the moment came, he reached out with his free hand and touched one of the pentagonal faces. The symbols on the dodecahedron's surface suddenly stopped their random movement and began to pulse in rhythm with Jake's heartbeat. The object attached itself to his other hand, and now he could feel the connections between all three pieces. The spiral structure and the dodecahedron were communicating with each other through harmonic frequencies that resonated in his bones. Professor Zeth Kamor's 6 arms moved in increasingly agitated patterns, the Xanthari equivalent of nervous excitement. "This is unprecedented," he declared to the watching crowd. "The human is ignoring 17 different physical principles and somehow achieving positive results. The mathematical models indicate this approach should result in immediate system failure, but Jake wasn't following mathematical models. He was following something much older and more fundamental, the human ability to navigate through space using intuition, rhythm, and feel. The same instincts that had allowed his ancestors to hunt in forests and navigate by stars were now helping him solve a puzzle that had stumped the galaxy's greatest minds. The 3 interlocking rings were the next challenge. According to Xanthari physics, they required precise mathematical manipulation to separate and realign. Jake approached them differently. As he spun with the spiral and dodecahedron, he could feel the rings' magnetic fields pulling at each other in complex patterns. Instead of trying to calculate the forces, he let his body respond to them naturally. The rings began to move in harmony with Jake's rotation, their crystalline surfaces singing with musical tones that matched the frequency of his heartbeat. One by one, they detached from each other and moved toward Jake's spinning form. As each ring approached, Jake used subtle shifts in his rotation to guide it into position. The rings didn't attach to his hands like the other objects. Instead, they began to orbit around his body, creating a 3-dimensional gyroscope that enhanced his stability and control. Lisa Shun, a quantum physicist watching from Earth via holographic link, leaned forward in amazement. "He's not solving the puzzle in sequence," she whispered to her colleagues. "He's creating a dynamic system where all the pieces work together. The rings aren't just puzzle components. They're providing gyroscopic stability that lets him control his rotation with incredible precision." The chamber filled with harmonic resonances as the objects began to sing together. The spiral structure hummed with deep bass tones, while the dodecahedron provided higher frequencies that created complex harmonies. The 3 rings added their own musical voices, creating a symphony that seemed to come from the very fabric of space itself. Jake could feel the remaining objects responding to the music. The pyramid with shifting surfaces began to change color and rhythm with the harmonies. The sphere with movable segments started clicking and whirring as its pieces rearranged themselves. The 2 rods that bent spacetime began to pulse with energy that Jake could feel in his bones. The alien observers were no longer just watching. They were witnessing something that challenged their fundamental understanding of how problems should be solved. The Xanthari had always believed that intelligence meant the ability to calculate, to reduce complex problems to mathematical equations. The Vakan thought that true understanding came from processing multiple dimensions of information simultaneously. The Rillan were convinced that quantum mechanics required pure, logical analysis, but Jake was demonstrating something entirely different. He was showing that some problems couldn't be solved by thinking harder. They had to be felt, experienced, and danced with. The universe wasn't just mathematical. It was also musical, rhythmic, and alive. And sometimes the best way to find the Solution was to become part of the problem itself. As Jake spun through the chamber with 3 objects now moving in harmony with his rotation, he felt a deep sense of rightness that went beyond logic or calculation. This was what humans were meant to do, not to compete with alien intelligence, but to bring their own unique gifts to the galactic community. The gift of intuition, of rhythm, of the ability to dance with the universe instead of just analyzing it. The final 3 objects awaited him, and Jake could feel their anticipation like a physical presence in the chamber. The puzzle was far from over, but for the first time since arriving at the Galactic Academic Exchange, Jake felt like he belonged among the stars. The pyramid with shifting surfaces was unlike anything Jake had ever encountered, even in his wildest dreams. As he approached it while spinning with the 3 objects already in harmony with his movement, the pyramid began to react in ways that made the alien observers lean forward with intense curiosity. Its faces changed from metallic silver to deep ocean blue to burning gold, each transformation accompanied by subtle changes in the gravitational field around it. Jake could feel the pyramid calling to him, not through sound or light, but through vibrations that resonated in his chest cavity. The shifting surfaces weren't random changes as he had first thought. They were responses to his emotional state, his heartbeat, his breathing patterns. The pyramid was trying to synchronize with him just as the other objects had done, but it needed something more personal than simple rotation. As Jake drew closer, he began to understand what the pyramid wanted. It wasn't enough to move with the correct rhythm. He had to feel with the correct emotion. The pyramid was responding to his confidence, his determination, his growing sense that he belonged in this place among the stars. When Jake felt doubt, the pyramid's surfaces became rough and dark. When he felt joy at his success so far, the surfaces became smooth and bright. Professor Zethkamor watched with growing fascination as the pyramid's transformations accelerated. "Impossible," he muttered, his crystalline voice carrying notes of scientific confusion. The pyramid responds only to mathematical frequencies, not to biological emotional states. The correlation should not exist. But the correlation did exist, and Jake was learning to use it. He reached out with his free hand, not trying to grab the pyramid, but simply offering it his touch. The moment his fingers made contact with one of the shifting faces, the pyramid's transformation stopped completely. Its surface became a mirror-like finish that reflected not Jake's image, but the patterns of energy flowing between all the objects now connected to his spinning form. The pyramid attached itself to Jake's hand with a warm sensation that spread up his arm and into his heart. Suddenly, Jake could feel the emotional states of all the objects in the chamber. The spiral structure felt curious and playful. The dodecahedron felt ancient and wise. The 3 rings felt protective and strong. The pyramid itself felt like a bridge, connecting the emotional and the logical in ways that pure mathematics never could. The sphere with movable segments was waiting for him next, its hundreds of triangular pieces clicking and whirring as they rearranged themselves into new patterns. Jake approached it with growing confidence, his rotation now enhanced by the gyroscopic stability of the rings and the emotional feedback from the pyramid. As he drew near, the sphere's movements began to mirror his own rotation, its segments shifting to match the rhythm of his spinning dance. This object was different from the others. While the previous pieces had responded to rhythm and emotion, the sphere seemed to require something more complex, a combination of physical movement, emotional state, and intellectual understanding. Jake had to think and feel and move all at the same time, creating a harmony between his mind, heart, and body that he had never experienced before. The sphere's segments suddenly locked into a new configuration, forming patterns that looked almost like a 3-dimensional map of the chamber. Jake realized that the sphere was showing him the solution, not through mathematical calculation, but through visual representation. He could see how all 7 objects needed to be positioned relative to each other, not as static pieces, but as dynamic components of a living system. As Jake reached for the sphere, its surface began to pulse with warm light that matched his heartbeat exactly. The moment he touched it, the sphere seemed to merge with his consciousness, flooding his mind with understanding that went beyond words or numbers. He could feel the quantum connections between all the objects, the way their energy fields created interference patterns that were both beautiful and functional. Dr. Amy Walsh pressed her face against the observation window, hardly believing what she was seeing. "He's not just solving the puzzle," she whispered to the other human observers. "He's becoming part of it." The objects aren't just tools anymore, they're extensions of his own body and mind. The two rod-like objects that bent space-time were the final challenge, and Jake could feel their power even from a distance. One rod seemed to absorb light and energy, creating a dark void in space that made Jake's eyes water when he looked at it directly. The other rod repelled everything around it, including photons, creating ripples in the fabric of reality that made the chamber walls shimmer and distort. According to everything Jake had learned about physics, these objects should have been impossible to handle safely. They were made of matter and antimatter, of positive and negative energy, of forces that should have torn apart anything that came between them. But as Jake spun toward them with the other 5 objects now part of his rotating system, he began to understand their true nature. The rods weren't weapons or tools. They were dancers. They had been waiting for someone who could understand their rhythm, someone who could move with them instead of trying to control them. As Jake approached, the rods began to pulse in alternating patterns, one expanding while the other contracted, creating a rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of the universe itself. Jake extended his arms toward both rods simultaneously, breaking one of Professor Zethka Moore's absolute rules. The professor gasped, his 6 arms moving in frantic patterns as he prepared to reset the puzzle. But instead of triggering a system failure, Jake's touch created something magnificent. The rods responded to his dual contact by creating a standing wave between them, a stable pattern of energy that connected all 7 objects in a complex geometric relationship. Jake found himself at the center of a 3-dimensional mandala made of light and matter and pure mathematics given physical form. Lisa Chun, watching from Earth, felt tears streaming down her face as she witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible according to any known physics. "He's created a stable exotic matter configuration," she said in a voice filled with wonder. "Those rods should have annihilated each other, but he's made them dance together instead." The chamber filled with music that came from the very structure of space-time itself. The 7 objects had found their perfect positions relative to each other, creating the eternal knot of Velshan, not through mathematical calculation, but through a kind of cosmic choreography that used Jake's human intuition as its guiding principle. The alien observers stood in stunned silence as the eternal knot rotated slowly around Jake's floating form. The configuration was more beautiful than any of them had imagined. A perfect balance of order and chaos that seemed to embody the fundamental harmony of the universe. It was exactly what the ancient Zenthari texts had described, but achieved through methods that none of their greatest thinkers had ever considered. Professor Zethka Moore's crystalline face showed emotions that had no names in any language. 3 centuries. He had believed that intelligence meant the ability to reduce complex problems to simple mathematical equations. But Jake had just demonstrated that some problems required not reduction but expansion, not calculation but participation, not thinking but being. The eternal knot pulsed with gentle light as it completed its first full rotation, and Jake felt a deep sense of completion that went beyond mere problem-solving. He had not just arranged 7 objects into a configuration. He had discovered a new way of relating to the universe itself, a way that honored both the mathematical precision that aliens valued and the intuitive wisdom that made humans unique. The chamber began to fill with harmonic resonances that seemed to come from the stars themselves, as if the entire galaxy was singing in celebration of this impossible achievement. Jake floated at the center of it all, no longer spinning, his task complete and his understanding forever changed. The silence that followed Jake's completion of the eternal knot was unlike anything the Galactic Academic Exchange had ever experienced. For nearly 10 minutes, no one spoke or moved or even seemed to breathe. The alien observers from dozens of different species stood transfixed, watching the impossible configuration rotate slowly in the center of the chamber like a three-dimensional prayer, made of light and mathematics. Professor HFY War was the first to break the silence, his crystalline voice carrying tones that the universal translator struggled to interpret. "You did not calculate," he said slowly, as if each word was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "You did not analyze the 17 physical principles. You did not process the 1,247 variables. You simply moved, and the universe moved with you." Jake floated in the center of the chamber, still connected to the 7 objects that now formed a pattern more beautiful than anything he had ever imagined. He could feel their contentment, their satisfaction at finally being in their proper places. After waiting so long for someone who could understand their true nature. "Professor," Jake said quietly, "maybe that's the point. Maybe the universe doesn't always want to be solved. Maybe sometimes it wants to be danced with." The implications of what had just happened began to ripple through the gathered crowd like stones thrown into still water. Dr. Amy Walsh was recording everything on her holographic device, knowing that this moment would change how humans saw themselves in the galactic community. The other human students looked stunned, as if they were seeing their own species for the first time, but it was the alien reactions that truly mattered. The Xanthari students were conferring among themselves in rapid, musical exchanges that sounded like crystal wind chimes in a hurricane. The Vulcan mathematician who had attempted the puzzle earlier was staring at Jake with all 6 of his eyes, his tentacles moving in patterns that indicated deep thought. The Rillan quantum specialist was making soft humming sounds that her species used when confronting ideas that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Professor HFY War approached the chamber controls with movements that seemed uncertain for the first time in his 3-century career. "The energy readings are stable," he announced to the watching crowd. "The eternal knot configuration is mathematically perfect, even though the method of achieving it defies all known approaches to problem solving." As Jake was transported back to the observation deck, the 7 objects remained in their perfect formation, continuing to rotate and pulse with gentle light. The eternal knot had become more than just a solved puzzle. It was a testament to the idea that there might be multiple ways of understanding the universe, multiple forms of intelligence that could work together rather than compete against each. The news of Jake's success spread through the galactic academic exchange, faster than light-speed communication could carry it. Within hours, representatives from dozens of species were requesting access to recordings of the event. Scientists who had spent centuries perfecting their logical approaches to physics suddenly found themselves questioning whether they had been missing something fundamental about the nature of reality itself. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the head of Earth's delegation to the exchange, arrived within hours of receiving Amy's emergency transmission. She found Jake in the human quarters sitting quietly by a window and watching the stars. "How do you feel?" she asked, settling into a chair beside him. Jake considered the question for a long moment. "Different," he said finally. "For 3 years I've been trying to prove that humans belong here by showing we can think like aliens. But maybe the point isn't to think like them. Maybe it's to think like ourselves and show them what that looks like." The academic revolution that followed Jake's achievement was swift and comprehensive. The Xanthari, led by Professor HFY War himself, proposed the creation of a new field of study they called empathetic physics. This discipline would explore how consciousness, emotion, and physical intuition could work alongside traditional mathematical approaches to unlock new understanding of the universe. The Vulcan began incorporating what they called motion meditation into their mathematical studies, teaching their students to feel the rhythms of the equations they were solving. The Rillan started exploring intuitive quantum mechanics, using dance and music to help them understand particle interactions that had previously required pure logical analysis. But perhaps the most significant change occurred within the human community itself. For the first time since arriving at the Galactic Academic Exchange, Earth students began to see their supposed limitations as actual strengths. The tendency toward intuition that aliens had criticized was reframed as a unique form of intelligence that could complement rather than compete with logical thinking. Jake was invited to become the first human professor in the exchange's history, tasked with developing curriculum that would teach alien students to incorporate human-style thinking into their problem-solving approaches. His first class was attended by students from 17 different species, all eager to learn what humans called dancing with the universe. The spiral structure, dodecahedron, 3 rings, pyramid, sphere, and 2 rods that made up the eternal knot were moved to a place of honor in the exchange's main hall, where they continued to rotate in their perfect configuration. Visitors from across the galaxy came to see the impossible solution, and many reported feeling something they had never experienced before. A sense that the universe was not just logical, but also beautiful. Not just mathematical, but also musical. Amy Walsh documented the long-term effects of Jake's achievement in her report to Earth's scientific community. Lieutenant Morrison's solution has fundamentally altered how we understand the relationship between different forms of intelligence. She wrote, "What we have always considered human limitations may actually be our greatest contributions to the galactic community." The Xanthari Academy of Sciences offered Jake their highest honor, the Crystal of Perfect Understanding, traditionally given only to individuals who had expanded the boundaries of knowledge itself. During the ceremony, Professor Zeth Kamor made a statement that would be quoted for generations. "We have learned that the universe is large enough to contain multiple forms of truth, multiple ways of knowing. The human approach does not replace our methods. It completes them." Jake accepted the honor on behalf of all humanity, but his acceptance speech was characteristically simple. "We didn't come here to prove we were as smart as you," he told the assembled alien dignitaries. "We came here to learn from you and to share what we had learned from our own world. Today, I think we proved that the universe is big enough for all of us to be right in our own ways." The eternal knot continued to rotate in its place of honor, no longer just a puzzle but a symbol of something greater. It represented the moment when humanity stopped trying to be something they weren't and started being exactly what they were. It showed that intelligence came in many forms, that wisdom could be found in calculation and in intuition, in logic, and in dance. Years later, when new species joined the Galactic Academic Exchange, they would always be brought to see the eternal knot and hear the story of the human who solved the impossible puzzle by spinning through space like a child on a playground. The story became a legend that spread across the galaxy, a reminder that sometimes the best way to touch the stars was not to reach for them with your mind, but to dance with them using your heart. And in the quantum foam of space-time itself, some said you could still feel the echo of Jake Morrison's dance, spinning through the cosmos like a prayer made of physics and hope, forever changing how the universe understood itself.